little bit about, talked about Ezekiel and some of Ezekiel's visions, his illustrated visions last Sunday, which some of y'all I think found quite interesting and kind of a little bit painful, where Ezekiel's wife died, and God says you need to get up and preach because that's how it's going to be for Judah. They're going to lose everything, and they're going to have to get up and go on. They're not going to have time to grieve or time to mourn. Pretty powerful stuff from Ezekiel. Uh-oh. 1 minute. But Ezekiel had a lot of other things. We don't have to have PowerPoint slides. We can do Ezekiel from memory. But Ezekiel had a lot of other things that are really fascinating about the book of Ezekiel and about the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a captivity prophet, but it was before Jerusalem was destroyed. It was in the first deportation of exiles from Jerusalem. Jerusalem rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar went in there and he took a bunch of the finest, choicest people out of Jerusalem, and he carried them off to the land of Babylon, which is kind of by the Indian Ocean, actually, kind of where Ezekiel was. And he carried them off to that land, and from there, Ezekiel became what we call a major prophet, which major prophets aren't more important than minor prophets. It's just they got longer books, okay? That's the only difference. But the major prophets, when you start talking about major prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah are all captivity prophets. Daniel was a captivity book. So all these people basically were contemporaries of one another. Jeremiah was prophesying at the same time that Ezekiel was prophesying, but Jeremiah was prophesying from Jerusalem. And the Lamentations, what we call Lamentations, if you got an old Bible, it says Lamentations of Jeremiah. But Lamentations were written actually after the destruction from a grotto in Jerusalem. Jeremiah wound up in Egypt, died in Egypt. But Isaiah is also a captivity prophet. So all these guys were contemporaries of one another. It was a very pivotal time in the history of Israel, in the history of Judah, because it was a big thing. Israel had already been carried off by now. Israel got carried off in 520 BC. Jerusalem's destroyed in like 486 BC. So Israel had already been carried off by the Assyrians. It's just Judah, Jerusalem, that area right there that's left. Now they've been carried off by the Babylonians, Ezekiel. But the fascinating thing I want to talk to you about tonight is, and I hope it doesn't I almost didn't do this, but I hope you kind of get something out of it, is the parallels between Ezekiel and John in the book of Revelation. You know, so many times people who aren't Old Testament students, which I think most of the world is probably not Old Testament students, and preachers tend not to teach much or preach much from the Old Testament, which we probably should more than we do. We miss these parallels between the Old Testament, especially books like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, and the book of Revelation. So when we read the book of Revelation in the New Testament, we think, oh, wow, you know, all these things John's talking about. Wow, this is amazing, about measuring the city and about the different faces of these beasts and about these cherubims and about all these other things and numbering the foreheads and all these other things we read about in Revelation. And we go, wow, this is all new, and this is all apocrypha, we call it, apocryphal writings, you know. This is all new, and it's all different, and it's going to come, and you know, it hasn't happened yet because we haven't seen these things yet. And so we get this real premillennialist view of Revelation. But the truth is that almost everything John talks about in the book of Revelation, Gog and Magog, if any of those things ring a bell to you, are talked about in the book of Ezekiel. Matter of fact, you could almost say that Ezekiel was the inspiration for Revelation, interestingly enough. And it is quite interesting to me. And so a lot of times when we get to the book of Revelation, we're like, oh, well, this is all new. But the truth is, it's ancient. And so sometimes we don't see that. And I think it's interesting to look, and especially when we start looking at Ezekiel. Ezekiel talks about, in Ezekiel 1:10, did y'all happen to read, did anybody in here read Ezekiel 1 after last Sunday's sermon? Ezekiel 1 is the great UFO chapter of the Bible, right? I mean, It's the great UFO chapter of the Bible. I used to have a Bible in the concordance. You looked up UFO, it said, see Ezekiel. Literally, that's what it said, see Ezekiel. So it's the great UFO chapter of the Bible, right? It's the huge vision of Ezekiel about the wheel in the middle of the wheel that moved in every direction, and the eyes and the crystal plate and the glory of God, and all those things that's in Ezekiel 1 are just almost beyond our imagination. And in the middle of Ezekiel 1, he talks about these creatures. And in Ezekiel 1 and 10, and it's really quite the picture of all this stuff. And it's very symbolic. And there's a lot of things in it when we look at it. It's almost hard for us to even imagine some of the things that Ezekiel is trying to describe to us. But in Ezekiel 1:10, it says, as for the form of their faces, and it's kind of interesting because we also look at this in Revelation. Each had a face of a man. All four had the face of a lion on the right, and the face of a bull on the left, and all four had the face of an eagle. So they had four different faces. So there's symbolism in that. Number one is they can see every direction. Nothing can sneak up on them because they can look every way. But there's other symbolism in this. Man is the crown of God's creation, the ruler of the earth, more or less, in the idea of creation. You're to rule over the beasts of the earth. The calf or bull, as it talks about in Revelation, is the king of the domestic animals. The lion is the king of the predatory animals. The eagle is the king of the flying animals, if you want to look at it that way. They all have predominance. They're all predominant images. And Ezekiel brings this up in Ezekiel 1:10, but the interesting thing is it's almost exactly what John talks about in Revelation chapter 4, verse 7. The first creature was like a lion, the second like a calf, the third had a face like that of the man, and the fourth was like a flying eagle. So when you start to look at Revelation, you think, oh, this is all new, and this is all, no, it's not, it's ancient. The things that John brings forth in Revelation are very reflective of the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was first by centuries. And so sometimes I think it's important we look back because it gives us a little understanding. I think Ezekiel is probably the strongest point for an amillennialist point of view, if you know what that means, that a revelation's already occurred instead of we're waiting for it to happen. Ezekiel's probably the greatest evidence that says, yes, revelation's already happened. That's probably a different lesson. In Ezekiel 3, 1 through 3, he said to me, son of man, eat what you find, eat this scroll. Go to speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he fed me the scroll, and he said to me, son of man, feed your stomach, fill your body with the scroll which I am giving you. Then I ate it, and it was sweet as honey in my mouth. The idea of eating the word of God, digesting it, putting it inside of you is not a new idea to the book of Revelation. Ezekiel is brought forth in the book of Ezekiel. I think there's a fascinating story about a king or somebody that was in Ethiopia that he literally believed this. He actually ate the Bible, 8 pieces of the Bible, interestingly enough. Literally, took this literally, actually 8 pieces of the Bible. That's kind of interesting to me. But in the book of Revelation, John says the same thing. So I went to the angel telling him to give me the little book, and he said, take it and eat it. It will make your stomachs bitter, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey. I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it, and in my mouth it was sweet as honey. And when I'd eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. I mean, it's hard to miss the parallels between Ezekiel and Revelation. They're so blatant and in your face. And so a lot of people who really study this, which are few, I might add, a lot of scholars who really study this, they really start to draw these great parallels and look at Ezekiel as being kind of the foundation of the inspiration for what John wrote in the book of Revelation. So it's kind of an interesting take. In Ezekiel 10:3, he brought there, behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze, with a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand, and he was standing in the gateway. And Ezekiel, like 4 or 5 chapters, maybe 6 chapters at the end of Ezekiel, deal with measuring things, measuring the temple, measuring the altar, measuring the land, division of the land when God calls Israel back, which is another lesson within itself. And this idea of measuring. And in the book of Revelation, we also see the one who spoke with me had a golden measuring rod to measure the city, its gates, and its walls, Revelation 21:15. And that's where we get the city, the four square. You know, we sing that song because it was measured. But the measuring rod, how big is it? You know, and that was really founded on the book of Ezekiel. So once again, we see this thing that Ezekiel did. I think this is really interesting. It came about the 6th hour, it's Ezekiel 8, the 5th day of the 6th month. I was sitting by my house, the elders of Judah sitting before me, and the hand of the Lord fell on me there. Then I looked, and behold, the likeness, the appearance of a man. From his loins and downward there was appearance of fire. From his loins and upwards the appearance of brightness, like the appearance of glowing metal. You see the language? You know, if you read this language in your mind, since we're New Testament people, don't you hear the language of the book of Revelation? If you've ever read the book of Revelation, don't you, when you read Ezekiel, don't you hear Revelation? Don't you hear the language? It's the same language, right? It's the same type of parallel, the same type of description that John used in the book of Revelation. But it's interesting as you read down through it, it says, stretched out the form of a hand. And that's another thing you really see in Ezekiel and you see in Revelation is form, sounds like, looks like, the appearance was like. If you really look at that, you'll see that over and over. Even in Revelation where John says harps, right? And we said they were playing harps, and we really kind of hone in on that, don't we? And we get the picture of angels playing harps. But if you really read Revelation, what does it say? A sound like harps. You know, in other words, all these things they're trying to describe in our terminology something that we can see, we can picture, but it's not literally what's there. The form of a hand doesn't mean it was a hand. The Bible uses that a lot. If you look at the baptism of Jesus, it says the Holy Spirit descended. It doesn't say as a dove, does it? It doesn't say the Holy Spirit was a dove that descended on Jesus. It says it was the form of a dove. Right? So a lot of times we miss that as we look at Scripture. And, of course, we're influenced by art. And art depicts these things in a literal sense. And we, in our mind, we equate that in a literal sense when actually it's not. It looks like, sounds like, form of, appearance of. And that's what it is here. It says, caught me by the lock of my head, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem. Remember how Revelation starts? John was in the Lord's day, right? And I had a vision. You know, what does Paul say in Corinthians? I had a vision. I know a man raised in the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, Paul says. You know, the vision of Revelation's caught up into heaven. There's always been the debate. You know, was he literally caught up into heaven? Was he in a vision? Did he see heaven? Once again, look at Ezekiel. You know, you see this terminology in Ezekiel. Lifted me up between heaven and earth. Literally lifted him up? I don't know. Spiritually lifted him up, and a vision lifted him up. You know, I mean, you get into that same argument. I don't know the answer, but it's the same idea. The Spirit literally took me, literally transported me to whatever, to this place, whether it was in my mind, in my spirit, in my soul, whether it was physically. The idea that the Spirit took me and showed me and revealed to me and demonstrated to me, and that fits right in with what John does in the book of Revelation. I think it's a fascinating idea. Suspended me between heaven and earth. What a tremendous vision, tremendous idea that Ezekiel puts forth. Probably one of the greatest things, marking the forehead. You know, we've heard that our whole lives, right? The mark of the beast and the mark of the forehead, and you know, is that a literal mark, and what is that mark? And, you know, when you ever study the book of Revelation, that's always a big thing that we look at, and you've got to go back to Ezekiel, and people rarely do, but you've got to go to Ezekiel when you study that, because Ezekiel talked about marking the foreheads a long time before John was ever born. And it's figurative, right, in the book of Ezekiel. And the same thing it is in the book of Revelation. It's a parallel. Where do you think this came from? You know, like I said, when you read Ezekiel and you almost see Revelation, you kind of see John's inspiration for the book of Revelation. Ezekiel says, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate with a shattering weapon in his hand. Among them was a certain man clothed in linen with a writing case at his loins. And they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. And the glory of the God of Israel went up from the cherub on which it had been to the threshold of the temple. And he called to the man clothed in linen, at whose loins was a writing case. And the Lord said to him, Go through the midst of the city, even through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations which are being committed in its midst. Did God mean that the man literally went out the book of Ezekiel and literally marked the people in Jerusalem? Absolutely not. Did God spare those people in Jerusalem because God had marked them? Absolutely. Was it a literal marking? Absolutely not. So if we understand that, then why do we go to Revelation and say, oh, it's got to be a literal mark, right? I mean, you got to look at Ezekiel. And so when you go to the book of Revelation and it says, saying, do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees till we have sealed the bondservants of our God on their foreheads. And that comes straight out of the book of Ezekiel. And was it a literal mark in Ezekiel? No. Was it a literal mark in Revelation? No, it's not. It's a mark that God knows. It's a mark that God sees. He's marked them. It's not physical. It doesn't matter what we see or don't see. It matters what God sees. They were told not to hurt the grass, the earth, or any green thing, Revelation 9. Only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. I looked and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, with him 144,000 having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. But even though you see that in Revelation, it comes from Ezekiel, right? And so sometimes you got to look at that parallel to say, what's going on? You know, how does this, you know, if I look at Ezekiel and I see that as a blueprint of Revelation, which it really is, and the more and more I study Ezekiel, the more and more I come to this understanding that it's a blueprint of Revelation. And John was relying on Ezekiel. I've got to believe John was relying on the book of Ezekiel when he wrote the book of Revelation. I just got to believe that. Then it really starts to kind of bring things a little more into perspective. He talks about the Davidic kingdom. Ezekiel does. In Ezekiel 38, he talks about the Davidic kingdom, about the idea that David will sit on the throne. Ezekiel 37, he talks about, I'm literally going to bring back Israel. Going to bring them back, put them back. And so the Jews, when they read Ezekiel 37, they're like, yeah, this Messiah has got to be this earthly king that's going to bring back Israel, because that's what Ezekiel 37 says. I'm going to physically bring back all those people of Israel that have been carried off by the Assyrians. I'm going to bring them back, and I'm going to put them back with Judah, and I'm going to make it all one nation, and I'm going to be their God, and they're going to be my people, and I'm going to protect them, and David's going to rule over them. That's what Ezekiel says. So how do we deal with that? Well, it's pretty simple. We're spiritual Israel, Galatians chapter 3, and we do live in a Davidic kingdom because Jesus is our king, and Jesus sits on the tribe of David. Jesus sits on the throne of David, Acts chapter 2. So it all makes sense, right? We are in a Davidic kingdom. Jesus is of that tribe, the tribe of Judah, the lineage of David. That's what's important. And so we sat under David, because in the Old Testament, your lineage was you, right? 2 Samuel 7, he says, I'm going to put one of your descendants on your throne, and I will establish his kingdom forever. And Peter says in Acts chapter 2 that David's dead and buried, and wasn't talking about David, but Jesus is who he was talking about. He's the lineage of David, the tribe of Judah, the line of the tribe of Judah, and he sits on our throne, and we're in a Davidic kingdom. And Ezekiel's the first one who really, well, you can go to 2 Samuel 7, but Ezekiel 38 is where he really says, we're going to be sitting under the throne of David. We're going to be under the throne of David as a kingdom. And that's exactly what we are. Very, very powerful prophetic utterance. Gog and Magog. I'm not going to get into Gog and Magog because it's too long of a thing, but we always talk about that in the book of Revelation. The war from the north in the book of Revelation, the exact same thing Ezekiel says. Gog and Magog. They're not literal enemies in Ezekiel. They're not literal enemies in the book of Revelation. They never were. There's no Gog and Magog. It's illustrative. It's of enemies against God and how God's going to overcome them. And so when we talk about that in the book of Revelation, we're talking about the same thing, but they start in the book of Ezekiel. And I think when you start looking at that, the prophetic utterances of Ezekiel, it really starts to bring home to me a lot of things. I just find it fascinating. I hope you do somewhat. The idea of what really, of the book of Revelation, how it ties in. And if you really start to look at it, you start to think, if these things occurred under Ezekiel, which a lot of it we know did, if these things occurred under Ezekiel, then why do we look at Revelation and say, oh, this has got to be literal in Revelation. It wasn't literal in Ezekiel. It wasn't literal in Isaiah. It wasn't literal in Jeremiah. It wasn't. You know? So when we get to the book of Revelation, everybody wants to say, oh, we got to take this literally. No, we don't. Because it was never literal. It wasn't literal here. It's not literal there. It's symbolic, illustrative, instructive, but it's not literal. And it's so important that we understand that, I think, and figure that out in our minds about exactly what's going on. And I think Ezekiel really helps to put that into perspective, the prophet Ezekiel. What a mighty prophet. What a mighty prophet of God was Ezekiel. You know, unbelievable, wasn't it? What he went through, riding on the brick, laying on his side for all those days, 40 days, right? 369 days, laying on his side, eating bread cooked over animal manure, prescribed by what God said, preaching to the mountains. Geez, what a guy, right? What a guy. And in the middle of this, he has all these visions, and he's caught up into heaven, and unbelievable. But when you read it, if you can read it, I know it's a long read, and I know it gets kind of redundant at times, but if you ever can manage to read through the book of Ezekiel and read through the book of Revelation, you can't help but looking at those two books and saying, man, these are a lot alike. These are a lot alike. And so I think that's a really great part about Ezekiel. Hope you found that interesting this evening. So glad that you're here. If we can assist you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand.